They're taking over. We just let them come. Once we had an empire, now we got some. White power! White power! Yeah.
Greetings. Once again, it's your host, Gabe Morales. I've researched, tracked, and personally interviewed hundreds of inmates with Aryan beliefs over the years. I did this while growing up, while working as an officer a half dozen years at New Folsom Prison in California, also working in classification at the King County Jail in Seattle for 2.5 decades. In addition, I've worked as a lieutenant at an undisclosed location, working with Eastern European and former Soviet Union inmates, many who have Aryan beliefs. I've also had some friends and relatives locked up in jail and prison, as described in previous episodes. Many people who don't know my complete background are often surprised to find out that I'm half white, or to be more exact, about a quarter Irish and a quarter English. This comes from my mother's side. And my father is Mexican American. Hardcore Aryans would call me a mutt, but that's okay, because I think a DNA test would likely show they are not as racially pure as they might want to believe. I'm not exactly sure when my ancestors on my mother's side crossed the Great Pond, but it was sometime in the 1800s. They arrived on the East Coast, then made their way to the state of Arkansas, where they fought on the rebel side during the Civil War. My mom's mother, my grandma Eunice Ellen Davis, was born in 1914 in northwestern Arkansas to Henry Wall and Minnie Bell Best. She grew up in the small town of Purdy, Arkansas, which is located in the foothills not far from the Ozarks, although my mother's side gets offended if you call them hillbillies. My grandmother was not well educated and had a daughter out of wedlock when she was very young. She later met and married her husband, my grandfather Charles, who I never knew and who died in the 1950s. So Grandma Eunice scrapped her way through life in and around Yakima, Washington, with her 5 children. My mom had me and my brother Joe with my father, and then she had my sister Laura from her stepdaddy Bill Larson, who was of Scandinavian heritage. My sister, rest in peace, was into role-playing with the Seattle Knights, who are still around and perform with the Puget Sound Pirates at local medieval festivals. I would not call the majority of people who go to those events Aryans or white supremacists at all. Most just want to enjoy the show and food, as well as learn more about their kindred. And there are many vendors there who sell items and are willing to teach you more about your European heritage. But there are some individuals in the US and other parts of the world who take this many steps further. They may join white supreme power groups and gangs, and we will discuss those groups throughout the remainder of this video. According to many historians, ancient Aryans existed in the 2nd millennium BC. They spoke an Indo-Iranian language. Yes, you heard it right, Iran and Indian, and were nomads and pagans. This legendary Aryan race is idolized today by many in the white supremacist movement, and they believe Caucasians were above average intelligence and had a superior culture to minorities, or mud people. While many groups include the word Aryan in them, they are not always racial purists. For example, the Aryan Brotherhood has a very close relationship to the Mexican Mafia. In fact, in the TV documentary, The Baron of the Brotherhood, I described the AB as being more like the Heroin Brotherhood, since they love to shoot up so much. Also, as I stated in the Aryan Brotherhood video on this channel and in my book on the AB, there were some Aryan Brotherhood in Washington State that were recognized by California or the feds, contrary to what I've heard some gang experts say. For instance, McNeil Island in Washington State, when it was under the federal BOP, housed several members. Other ABs with ties to the Pacific Northwest were Donald Rodent Leach from Oregon, who was hit in 1987 at Tehachapi Shoe by AB members Eddie Burnett, Rick Lee Terplinger, and Donnie Troxel, who today sits on the Aryan Brotherhood Commission. And I know about a dozen more who had ties to the Northwest, including Wayne Bridgewater, who was mentioned in the AB RICO case and directly cited in their war against the DC blacks. Bridgewater was tutored in the federal system under California ABs and directly worked with George Harp, one of the first ABs from California sent to the federal system, as shown in the upper right and lower left-hand picture, where he is standing to the right of Harp and Kenny Agtuka, who was president of the Washington Lifers Club in the white t-shirt just to Harp's left. To understand the evolution of the Aryan family, one must go back in time. In September 1993, a notorious inmate named Kenny Atuka came to the King County Jail located in downtown Seattle, Washington, on a U.S. Marshal's transport order, with no clear heads up or officer security alert on his deck card. Due to this oversight, Atuka was placed in general population. As I recall, and I saw this personally, he was placed 8 East, C tank. This was a close security unit, and I saw something very unusual. All of the inmates in the tank were looking out at I-5 away from the TV or glancing at us officers, while I noticed just one buffed out new inmate on the TV side of the tank, sitting by himself with his arms crossed, looking all too comfortable. This was off baseline from what I was normally used to. So I pulled his inmate card and checked his classification file to verify my suspicions. He was soon correctly ID'd by me as a shot caller from the Lifers Club and a member of the Aryan Brotherhood, reclassified and put on ultra security status until February 1994. While he was in custody, reports from informant state he renewed old contacts and found out who was who in Washington state. You see, Atuka led the Lifers Club at the Washington State Pen in Walla Walla, Washington, way back in the late 1970s. Atuka was half Filipino and half white and was from the Seattle area and known as a very savvy criminal. Even though he was young, Atuka rose up the ranks to become president of the Lifers Club at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, Washington, back in the late 1970s. And his enforcer was Al Gilchrist. Here you can see both men shown sitting awaiting trial in the King County Courthouse for violent crimes they committed while in prison. I interviewed Big Al years later after the mugshot on the left was taken. He told me that he was never really into the white power thing. He just did what he had to do to survive at the time and was now into yoga and spirituality. I think he even referred to himself as being Prince Siddhartha, which was the original name of the Buddha. But because of his activities at the Washington State Pen, as documented in the book Concrete Mama, Atuka was sent off to the federal BOP, and he soon became a respected member of the Aryan Brotherhood in the federal system after he killed William Stansfield at USP Atlanta. The hit was ordered by federal AB shot caller Barry Mills, who also had inmate Robert Conley killed in 1977 at McNeil Island when it was a federal pen. There was a federal congressional hearing concerning AB events in the 1980s, and Atuka's name is contained in documents as being a key player. It was because of this relationship with Kenny in the Aryan Brotherhood that the Aryan family were aligned, but they also feuded at times. By August 1994, several inmates in Washington, D.C. began organizing with skinhead groups out in the free world. There was also a movement among white prisoners who were proud of their race called the Peckerwoods. By and large, they were not an organized security threat group with any clear leadership or structure outside the state of Washington. But that soon changed as they operated as the Woodpile. Around 1996, a Washington State Ghost Rider motorcycle club member named Jeff Fatboy Heath wanted to form a group to combat Hells Angels aggression as the HAs moved in the state a few years early in Spokane and killed a Ghost Rider. The club was dying out. It was in disarray and a former shell of itself. Heath wanted to have a white protection group within the Washington Department of Corrections and return control of the institution back to whites, as they did back in the days of Concrete Mama. Eventually, he dropped the idea, but it was picked up by another inmate from Washington and Nevada who knew both Aryan warriors in Nevada and Aryan Brotherhood members in California and the feds. This was Richard R.C. Carmichael, who, with the blessings of Atuka, was joined by Atuka's former federal BOP cellie, David Davidson, who I personally interviewed at length, and a former Marine convict called Tex Turner. For multiple AF informants, these three individuals made up the original 3 teardrops on the official AF patch. For a retired Nevada Sergeant, Bill Valentine, Carmichael was a very dangerous individual and a stone-cold killer, with a trail of murders stretching from Washington State to Florida. Carmichael was the one that really developed the AF by bringing in the Woodpile and various skinhead groups. This original Aryan Family 3-man council was later expanded to an 8-man council, and Carmichael created other AF cells outside the state. In a 2010 lawsuit filed against Washington, D.C., Carmichael admits that he was one of the founding members of the Aryan family. However, he testified the original purpose of the Aryan family was just to try to educate young people about their identities and the wrong path of taking extreme racist views, to encourage education and becoming productive members of society after prison. Of course, his story does not match up to reality. In early 1983, while he was incarcerated at the Washington State Reformatory, Carmichael planned an escape by leading officials to believe that his life was in danger in general population. So he knew that he would be placed into protective custody status pending investigation into the matter. Carmichael told several prisoners what he was doing beforehand and even after he was in PC. These prisoners went to prison officials and advised them that the information about Carmichael's life being in danger was just a misunderstanding. After his release back to general population, Carmichael arranged for an associate to stab him in the stomach. When he was transported to the hospital, Carmichael escaped with the aid of outside associates. After his escape, Carmichael went to Nevada where he killed 2 people, for which he did time for later in the Nevada DOC. After the Aryan family was created, Carmichael also created the Trotha Wotan, and he was no longer considered in charge of the AF, as many members felt that he was only using the group for his personal gain. The new AF council began to recruit, gain strength, and prey on sexual offenders, rapists, and weaker inmates to make them bring in drugs or put money on their books. They would also often use the slogan, always and forever, code for AF, Aryan Family. The Aryan family were very disruptive within Washington DOC, the King County Jail, and other jails in Washington State, as well in the federal system. In the year 2000, an AB member was killed at USP Lompoc, California, by Aryan family member James Gearjammer Remington. Remington had the typical lightning bolts on his neck for the kill, with the letters A and F. This incident caused a lot of strife between the AF and ABs until Kenny Aktuka stepped in. Unfortunately for him, Aktuka later ran into issues with federal AB shot caller David the Beast Zahakian, so Aktuka was deemed no good by the AB. Although several Washington DOC investigators have denied its existence, I was told by multiple Washington DOC corrections officers coming through the academy when I was a TAC officer for 2 years that there was, in fact, a loose-knit group they observed called the Woodpile at higher security prisons. In addition, I interviewed several inmates with peckerwood tattoos that told me about the existence of the Woodpile. So while it may have not met the criteria for Washington DOC as a security threat group, I believe they did exist. The Woodpile was believed to operate like the Nazi lowriders were to the Aryan Brotherhood. It was basically a junior farm team. The AF also used Hockencrew skinheads and other skinheads as members. But later, Hockencrews in particular did their own thing. For any of you former Washington State DOC inmates, I'd like to hear if you have a different version of how it all went down, as well as the current status of the AF. I'm always willing to learn more. The European Kindred was founded by Isaac Ellis and David Kennedy and other inmates in the Oregon Department of Corrections system at the Snake River Correctional Institution in 1998. Allegedly, EK was named on April 20th, Adolf Hitler's birthday. Kennedy formed the EK for protection from other non-white gangs, and he designed the logo after the dead Kennedys, a band that used a very similar symbol for its logo. Kennedy had different ideas on how to run the group than did another group active at the time called Volksfront, which I'll also cover here shortly. The EK attracted more peckerwoods, whereas Volksfront attracted more skinheads. There were some skinheads that joined EK, but later most of them dropped out due to the EK's involvement with dope and not being dedicated to the skinhead movement. The EK has a long war with the Aryan soldiers, but has had no major issues with the Aryan family, as far as I know. And most other white cars or security threat groups get along with the EK on respect for respect agreements. Initially, it was a requirement for inmates who wanted to join the EK to assault a staff member. They may use a 5 and 11 to represent the letters EK, the 5th and 11th letters of the alphabet. Initially, the EK shield was supposed to be placed on the right calf, but since then it has been found on other parts of the body, including on founder David Kennedy. EK members will also often have many Norse and Celtic symbols, monikers, and have other types of European kindred symbols. All medium and high level security prisons in Oregon had an EK presence. and I cover the EK much more in depth in my book, Prison Gangs in America. Another gang with heavy influence in Oregon DOC is the Brood. Out on the street, the gang was involved in stealing vehicles, doing burglaries and home invasions, as well as committing armed robberies. The Brood is traced back to 1986, starting out with just 4 members and grew slowly through quality recruitment. Brood stood for Brothers Running Over Ordinary Dogs, and they were sometimes used by motorcycle gangs as enforcers. They were heavily involved in the meth trade and quickly aligned with the EK as more and more Brood members went to prison. David Joseph Peterson, better known as Joey, was a member of an Oregon group called the Aryan Death Squad. In December 2013, an ADS co-conspirator, Corey Eugene Wyatt, revealed new details about Peterson's crime spree in 2011 that left 4 people dead. Wyatt was originally indicted on 5 counts with his wife, Kimberly Scott Wyatt, but he soon pleaded guilty to 2 counts in a plea bargain. He told the court that he transferred a firearm to Joey, a convicted felon, and helped Peterson and his girlfriend, Holly Ann Grigsby, with a stolen vehicle they used to cross state lines. Joey Peterson told Wyatt that he needed a gun to commit robberies and carry out a white supremacist revolution in a conspiracy that included researching and gathering the names of prominent Jewish leaders and Jewish organizations in Seattle, Washington, Portland, Oregon, and Sacramento, California, to identify potential targets for elimination for his revolution. After their arrest, Grigsby and Peterson expressed white supremacist beliefs in media interviews. According to the documents, Peterson was a mixed martial arts fighter and had a tattoo of a swastika on his chest above his heart, as well as an image of Adolf Hitler on his stomach. He also had the initials SWP for Supreme White Power tattooed on the front of his neck. Both Peterson and Grigsby were brought up on federal RICO charges, convicted, and sent to prison. The Idaho prison system had several riots during the 1970s. For instance, inmate Ronald Masek was involved in a 1971 prison murder. The system was very outdated and brutal, and inmates within Idaho DOC started to organize. A former Idaho Department of Corrections investigator, Rondo Jackson, quickly learned that in order to understand Aryan gangs in Idaho, one must go back in history to study their literature and beliefs. In 1973, there was a riot at the prison of Boise. Inmates were moved to facilities south of town. At that time, the Aryan Brotherhood was still relatively new in California, but it would not take very long for similar groups to reach Idaho. On September 25, 1988, there was a riot at the Idaho State Corrections Institution. One protective custody inmate, Richard Holmes, was killed. Inmate William Dunn, cited as a founder of the Aryan Knights, played a major role in this incident, and he was later sent to Walla Walla Prison in Washington State. While he was incarcerated there, he became fully indoctrinated into beliefs of being a true Aryan. In November 1989, the new Idaho Maximum Security Institution opened, and Dunn kept in touch with his brothers back home. The United Aryans began in 1995 at the Idaho Max Security Institution, mainly in the Administration Segregation's B Block. Some of the influential members were Sean Stover, Mike Collins, and Flip McAllister. Their infrastructure was based on a group from Michigan DOC called the Iron Eagle Skins. In April of 1996, a number of Idaho inmates received a newsletter called The Voice. This newsletter showed inmates how to set the group up within prison units, including bylaws and constitutions, and ways to enforce their laws. On May 22, 1996, 6 Aryan United inmates incited a mini riot within the Idaho system. These inmates armed themselves with broken off pieces of metal from recreation cage fencing. This was a test to see who had the balls to be in the Aryans United. In June of that year, the first true Idaho prison gang was validated. The Aryan United Constitution was written, and all members signed a blood oath. The Aryans United died down in the late 1990s as Stover, Collins, and McAllister were released, but new groups took their place. The Dogs of War prison gang was formed at the Idaho State Correctional Institution in Boise in early 2002. These were senior white inmates on the prison yard. They were the rule makers, and their enforcers helped them carry out the rules. Dogs of War rules stated, brothers before others, no snitching, brothers before hoes, members must be white, relationships with blacks are not allowed, and no sex offenders. They also had a policy of mandatory workouts because they always wanted to be ready for any confrontation with the enemy. Vote on new members were held at prison meetings called the Dog Pound, but the group was eventually outshouted by the Aryan Knights, who became the most powerful gang within the Idaho Department of Corrections. The Aryan Knights were formed in the mid to late 1990s at the Idaho Maximum Security Institution by an offender named Will Dunn, mentioned previously. Since that time, they have been the most violent Aryan security threat group in Idaho and have an estimated membership of around 200 members. The Aryan Knights also spread out to the streets. They were similar in makeup to Washington's Aryan Family and Oregon's European Kindred. They may use an AK or 111 for corresponding letters of the alphabet, or a clock with hands at the 111 position, etc. They control many smaller Aryan groups like the Peckerwoods and severely violent criminals. The AK does not control most Idaho skinheads who do not like the way Aryan Knights overtly confront staff and bring too much attention to themselves. The AK are heavily into extorting sexual offenders for rent and are into drug trafficking as well as using drugs, something any true skinhead is against. The severely violent criminals began as a young rap group in Pocatello, Idaho. They were rowdy teenagers, mostly raised by their grandparents, and often had mothers and or fathers who were in and out of the Idaho prison system, some of whom were Aryan Knights. They soon developed into a gang. Severely violent criminals met in juvenile custody, then spread out to the street as various members were released and are still active today. This concludes part 1 of Northwest Aryan Gangs. Part 2 will follow shortly.